Mike Govanen, and welcome to the Palantir podcast, the broadcasting arm of GHG Palantir, which is an offshoot of the nonprofit Grey Havens Group. Find out more about us by searching for the Grey Havens Reading Group on Facebook or going to greyhavensgroup.org. We've continued our discussion of the Silmarillion with chapters 4 and 5 of Thingol and Melian, and of Eldamar and the princes of the Eldalie. These chapters, in some sense, are almost encyclopedic in their nature, being more of an exposition on the nature and families and groupings of the Eldar, as well as their travels and their establishment of homelands and societies more than anything else. We have some level of narrative in terms of how the elves finally come to Valinor, but beyond that, it's primarily a who's who. Who are the figures that we should pay attention to over the course of the rest of the book? We start with the tale of Thingol and Melian and their meeting in the forests of Beleriand. Thingol, otherwise known as Elwë, is the leader of the Teleri, the elves which follow after the Vanyar and the Noldor, and tend to tarry along the way. And he often goes to meet with Finwë, the leader of the Noldor, and passes through the woods on his way. One of these times, he comes across Melian in the wood and is spellbound, and spends innumerable number of years in her presence, and she in his, while all of the other events happening for the rest of the Eldalie occur around them. To continue in terms of the story, what is happening at this moment is all of the elves have been moving steadily west, towards the shores of Beleriand. The Vanyar and the Noldor reach the shore first, where the Valar have sent Olmo of all Valar to bring them across to Valinor. Now, if you recall, Olmo is one of the few who argued against the elves being brought in the first place. He argued for their freedom and for them remaining in Middle-earth and finding their own way. So it's an interesting choice on their part. In any case, we also hear that Olmo speaks to them and sings to them through use of the sounds of the sea, and thereby instills within the elves a love of the sea. And so we have him to blame for it. It's not necessarily something that just comes intrinsically to the elves, but something that has been stirred in their heart by Olmo. Well, Olmo takes an island from the Bay of Valar, off the shore of Beleriand, and the Noldor and the Vanyar board, if you will, onto this island, and it's dragged across to Eldamar, where the Vanyar and the Noldor then settle. The Teleri at this point are still beyond the river Gelion and have in Osiriand and have not yet come to the western shores. They follow after. Now, part of this has to do with them wanting to know where their leader is, who's been having his long, drawn-out staring contest with Melian. And part of it is that they just have a tendency to need to be chivied along. Well, they finally do come to the western shores, and the Noldor and the Vanyar aren't there. They grow to have a respect for and a rapport with Ossë and Uinen, the Maiar under Olmo, and learn from them a love of the sea, and eventually of shipbuilding and shipcraft and sailing. Over the course of many long years, long space of time, the Noldor and the Vanyar have been petitioning to the Valar that the Teleri should be brought to Valinor as well. And so Olmo returns with the island, and the Teleri come. But not all of them do. Some stay behind in search of Elwë. These are the Egloth, the Forsaken. And some stay behind because they love that land and the oceans and the Bay of Valar. And they are the Thalathrim. And they are ruled by Cirion, the same Cirion we see in The Lord of the Rings. So the Teleri are brought across, the majority, on the island, which will be set off the shores of Aman, off the shores of Valinor, and become Tol Eressëa, the Lonely Isle. Now, part of this is because the Teleri love the island. They love the sea. They love the ocean. They don't want to, at least at first, be always in the light. They want to perceive the stars. They want to perceive the ocean. And so also because of Olmo's own desire that was ignored, that the Eldar remain in Middle-earth, he acquiesces and roots the island away from the shore. Now eventually the Teleri learn shipcraft and will cross over. But enough time passes that their language is sundered from that of the Vanyar and the Noldor. Eventually they'll pass over to the shore and found the city of Aquilunde. Now, this whole narrative, which is ultimately a fairly short sequence within these chapters, is bound up in the notion of countless years passing. And just as we've discussed in the past, the major thrust of our conversation this morning had to do with the nature of time, and in particular, the nature of time as it relates to the Eldar. Would elves perceive time the same way we as humans would? At this point, there is no sun, there is no moon by which to gauge time by. There is the passage and wheeling of the stars in the heavens. There's the growth of trees, which is evident. And there's the generations of the elves. Those are about the only markers of time that actually exist in any form at this point. So how do we understand what is happening? How do we understand the magnitude of these events, traversing whole continents and whole oceans by almost a tectonic means? We don't really know. The only gauge we've been given thus far is the 7-hour cycle for each of the trees. But as we discussed before, do we even know that that hour is equal to the hour that we know and are familiar with? This led to a discussion on the nature of oral versus written history. And the reality is, in the Silmarillion, we haven't reached a period of written history or recorded history. Everything to this point is about speech, about oral history. And when you go back to mythologies of the past, which were primarily passed down in an oral tradition, they are more likely to list important people, families, events, and places than they are anything to do with a year or an actual timestamp. It's much more about the family and the generation than anything else. If you look at ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, more often than not what you had was a case of the ruler at the time being the form of identification of the time, and then you'd count the year based on how long they'd been reigning. The same sort of thing holds true in the Silmarillion here. The only true sense we have of time passing is generational. We have those who woke up at the shores of Guivianen, namely the leaders of the three tribes of the Eldar, Ingwe, Olwe, or Elwë, and Finwë. Then we have their sons, or at least the sons of Finwë, Feanor, Fingolfin, and Finarfin. And then in terms of sequencing of time, you could even split Feanor, Fingolfin, and Finarfin into two generations, given that they are two different wives of Finwë. And then you have the children of each of those. That's really the only way we can have a sense of time. But that's if we're coming at this from a human angle. If you recall, in The Lord of the Rings, when the Fellowship leaves Lothlorien, Sam is confused because it would appear that a full cycle of the moon has happened, and yet he doesn't feel like that amount of time has actually passed. He can't understand where the time has gone. Legolas responds by essentially saying that to an elf, time passes in both fluid, quick, and slow patterns, and that it isn't a set and regimented course. So what we did as a group this morning is really try to understand and try to approach time as perception, and as perception from a being which doesn't really have the same needs for food or for rest that we do. Because remember, as Legolas says, an elf is able to sleep in almost a wakeful state and still walk around and do things in the world and live in a sort of dreamlike state and gain their rest thereby. So how can we understand? Because the other factor in here, which can be thought of, is the notion of how we ourselves begin to partition time based on our meals, based on our work, based on appointments. Well, one of the anecdotes that I brought up was with an elderly woman who had been interviewed testing for dementia. And one of the first questions was, well, what day of the week is it? And she responded by saying, what do I care what day of the week it is? I'm retired. I live alone. I don't have anywhere to go. I have no appointments. I have no need to know what day of the week it is. And so it's all frame of reference. For an elf, what do they really need? Do they even have a circadian cycle like we humans do? Or are they able to essentially set off and demarcate time more based on projects that they undertake than either the wheeling of the stars or the day-night cycle or when they eat? For that matter, do they even eat on a certain schedule, or is it more a la carte of when they're hungry they eat and they come together? Looking at the Hall of Fire in Rivendell, do they come together and commune, not necessarily as a scheduled thing, but more that they have feasts, they have food that's ongoingly present and there and available, and they all partake as they desire and come together communally for a feast or for a council, more out of the need for the answer of a question or for companionship or for celebration than for any other reason. Therefore, you can have a case where an elf is building a building and could take 100 years for a human, and yet to an elf may be perceived as a single day or a week or who knows. And looking specifically at the case of Thingol and Melian, he's cast under a spell. He could be potentially under the power of Melian in a sort of bubble in which time stops. Or is it more the case, like we ourselves experience, that we are so incredibly captivated, say in a movie, in a book, in an activity, in a conversation, that we completely and utterly forget to even look at the concept of time, to look at the clock, to look at what the light is doing outside, to pay attention to our bathroom needs or our food needs and our hunger, and go a long stretch of time and all of a sudden reach the end of it and think that was but a minute. It's all based on perception, and it is all based on what reference points we have. And the truth is, in the Silmarillion, up until the creation of the sun and moon, we don't have a frame of reference. At least nothing so concrete that we, in our current society and in our current way of thinking, can truly understand. The closest we can get is a generational understanding. And the funny thing, too, is this whole idea, this concept of trying to wrap your mind around time and how time is split into segments, into a way of ordering life, this has been something that we as a group have been grappling with. Is how do you understand, in a sense, a period without time? A period that can't really be defined in any more clear way than to say the time before the world was made, the time when the world was made, but the children weren't born yet, the time when the children were awoken, and then the generations thereafter. For us in our day and age, this is a little bit mind-boggling. And Tolkien himself almost grappled with this problem too when you look at the Book of Lost Tales, because he speaks of the nature of the creation of time and the ordering of time, and this is an actual myth built into the story of the creation of the sun and moon, and that this, in a sense, is a gift Iluvatar gives to the Valar, because the Valar are incapable initially of actually controlling the sequence of time. And we can talk about that more later. When we continued then on to the 5th chapter of Eldamar and the Princes of the Eldalie, we came to another level of understanding. Because one of the things that comes of the Teleri being who they are and kind of becoming distracted along the way and falling in love with the rivers or the ocean or the harbor or what have you, and wanting to settle along the way and split among their various kindreds, what ends up happening is their own language is sundered from that of the Noldor and the Vanya. That they form a related but different dialect or even different language than what the other Eldar speak. And this too is going to be compounded by the fact that among all of these offshoots that come from their travel from Cuiviénen to the western shores of Middle-earth, almost all of them are coming from among the Teleri, who are going to be the most separated and the most behind out of all of the other Eldar. And so you have the Sindar, who are formed of those who stay in Middle-earth, and you have the Teleri, who ultimately come to the utmost west and form their own language, or at least dialect, as well as their own living outside of Valinor in Aqualonde. So the question then can be made or posed, is the way we are to understand the passage of time demarcated by the development of language? Are we to understand the ages that pass, the years that pass, in terms of the evolution of one language into another distinct from what came before and distinct from what developed parallel? Thinking about this and looking back at the previous chapters, which really were cases of practical and literary philology, and how language was created and developed and changed, that's what we have here. And it makes a lot of sense from the standpoint of the author himself, what he was interested in and what he studied, because Tolkien would have been very intimately aware of how these sort of processes took place. He also would have known to some degree what sort of time it took for something like this to occur. And granted, that can be very quick when you have a group of people like the Noldor who are stated to be very much interested in language and very keen to create more and better words to describe the things around them. Now, one of the interesting things and humorous things that came up in our meeting was starting to look at the character of the three kindreds. You have the Vanyar, who essentially sit at the feet of Varda and Manwë, and for the sake of the story, to a large degree, disappear from view. You have the Noldor, who are very interested in craft, they're very curious, they want to find out about everything, they want to create. And then you have the Teleri, who follow after, who want to enjoy life, who really become involved with the beauties of the world, becoming enamored of the natural beauty of the world, namely in the case of rivers, forest, and the sea. And we had been talking about pets a little bit earlier in our discussion, and so it came up that we could start to pin a specific type of pet onto each of these kindreds. You have the Vanyar, who are essentially your quintessential dog, obedient to and loving the Valar. You have the Noldor, who are ferrets, who are incredibly and insatiably curious, and potentially even to the point of harming themselves. Not necessarily knowingly, but still in the maxim that we have today of curiosity killed the cat. Very similar case with the Noldor. And then the Teleri, who are in a sense cats, in that they need to be chivied along. They're going to wait for you to come and get them. Otherwise, they're going to become interested in what their current setting is. Now, the other thing that we looked at for some time was the very last passage of the 5th chapter of Eldamar and the Princes of the Eldalie. And it's interesting because it's the sort of passage which you should read and kind of look at it almost like a Rorschach test of what does it immediately bring to mind? What does it immediately refer to in your memory or in your culture? And we questioned if there is a real reference being made here that we should be able to identify, whether it is something brought by Tolkien, that Tolkien had specific creatures in mind, or if this is a case of mystery and a case of seated applicability that each reader then can insert themselves. And it reads, "For all living things that are or have been in the kingdom of Arda, save only the fell and evil creatures of Melkor, lived then in the land of Aman. And there also were many other creatures that have not been seen upon Middle-earth, and perhaps never shall be, since the fashion of the world has changed." Now they're referring to, presumably, the change of the world that comes through the bending of the ocean during the sinking of Numenor at the end of the Second Age. But what is curious is this mention of other creatures that have not been seen upon Middle-earth, which exist in Valinor. For two of us in our group today, that immediately brought to mind unicorns, perhaps based on the common myth of the unicorns being killed and flooded in the flood of Noah's Ark. For another in the group, it immediately brought to mind a phoenix. What creatures perhaps exist in Valinor that exclude the fell and evil characters, but are some creature that exists beyond, that doesn't exist in Middle-earth, but does in Valinor? Now, interestingly enough, we don't necessarily know, and we can't necessarily know, because if we take with a grain of salt the idea that the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings are a form of prehistory for our own world, well, that means that these creatures, which we may have been aware of at one point or another, at least in terms of mythology, have been removed and are now no longer part of the world. Whereas those creatures which we have in mythology, like dragons, creatures of fire like the Balrogs, beasts and monsters, being creatures of Melkor, still exist and therefore figure greatly in mythology. What are these creatures? Who could they be? What could they be? It's an interesting question. In any case, I invite you to join us next time as we move on to chapter 6 of the Silmarillion and begin to move into the meat of the Quenta and into the initial depredations of Melkor. And we get to meet in more detail and depth the character of Fëanor. Until next time.